Good morning, everyone. So I want to start a little bit by reflecting. I'm happy we had a land acknowledgement, and I want to kind of reflect on our responsibility to think about the stories that we share in this space and the stories about this space. And as a white settler who is researching the violence of displacement and gentrification and these other forms of urban inequity and disbelonging, I want to also begin by acknowledging that urban planning and architecture and development and real estate and urbanism have all been, and they continue to be, participant in these violent systems of oppression that include settler colonialism and racism and capitalism and cis hetero patriarchy and ableism. And I really want to express my gratitude to Black and Indigenous and queer and Crip folk who share their knowledge and their experiences that unsettle these systems, and my gratitude for what I've learned from listening to them, and gratitude for being welcome to participate and contribute to these conversations. And I have such a deep respect for these spaces where we gather to share knowledge and to build relationships that are based in trust and care for all of the communities that gather here. Creative Mornings is one of these special spaces of sharing and community building, and I wish we could be gathered in one place together, but we're so fortunate that we can make do with and find different ways to share in this virtual space. And in that spirit, I have a few reflection pauses spread throughout the talk where we can, I hope you might feel moved to also share some of your stories and share some of your reflections, either in the chat. We'll also have one more breakout room, and then again in the discussion session afterwards, which, you know, you're welcome to pose questions, but I hope we can have a bit more of a shared conversation in that space. And I'm really thrilled that today's talk landed on the Jewish festival of Purim. Chag Sameach, everyone. Purim is a really joyful festival. It's all about making noise and being seen. And today we celebrate the story of Esther, who became queen, but she was forced to hide her Jewish identity and her Jewish background. And when she's told of a plot to murder the Jewish people in her kingdom, she has to confront the conflict of her own privilege and her position to help to save her people at the risk of losing everything she has by revealing her true identity and speaking her truth. And so it's a lesson in fitting in and getting by, and that's not good enough. It's about confronting power and oppression and our need to be seen for who we are. And so taking this theme of divergence and sharing stories about my own divergent paths and some divergent places and my hopes for divergent plans moving forward is a really meaningful way for me to celebrate today with you. So thank you for joining me. So place-based storytelling has become a really important part of my own practice and my research. And these stories tell us so much about our ability to form attachments with each other in space and with the space, and how we shape cities and how the cities help to shape us, and what it means for us and what it takes for us to transform these cities meaningfully together, and what cities we want to imagine. So during the breakout, we were kind of posed the question about what makes a good city. What do you imagine when you think of a good city? And we had a great chat in my breakout room, and I hope all of you did too. And this question kind of through Twitter and through the warm up, I have some kind of predictions and some observations about what those conversations look like. And I think a big part of what we think of when we're asked to envision in the city is literally what we envision, what we see and what we want to see. We describe architecture and the materials, the style, the scale, the views that we imagine, the design of streets and parks and plazas. We want to see beautiful street art. And then we tend to think about the amenities of the city, the things that there are to do and the places there are to go. We want great music venues and cultural centers. We want to support local businesses and restaurants that have great patios and cafes. We want to see good art districts and libraries and festivals. And then we also have lots of services from the city, things like snow clearing and public bathrooms and recycling programs. And then from there, we tend to think about, okay, so how are we going to move around from this? And so a lot of people think about their mobility in the city as part of what makes a good city. Our different modal choices, and I'm sure there were lots of conversations about bike lanes and traffic and parking, public transportations and our sidewalks. And the way we kind of also participate in these conversations and these ways of imagining cities together often uses these urbanism buzzwords that are kind of floating around and that help us help us to imagine and help us to put words to what we're imagining. Things like the 15-minute city and walkability, creative cities, cities for people, cities for all, smart cities and affordability and sustainability. And we're going to return to some of these later. But I think what often we forget to think about, and we've maybe been trained to not think about or to think of as what a city is, are people and our embodied experiences of the city through all of the other senses we have beyond just our sense of sight. What are our spiritual and our psychological experiences, the people that we interact with, the emotions we feel, the memories we have, our different attachments and the history of the space and the stories we want to tell about the space. And when it comes to cities, our popular imagination really does seem to be obsessed with form and function of cities, right? And there's such a huge emphasis on good being defined through the aesthetics and through the design and through the function that those support. So this is where I want to start to interrogate the role that architecture and planning have had and the power they've had on how cities are built and who they get built by, and how that shapes the mainstream imagination about what cities are and what cities could be. So when I'm pressed for a speaker bio, I do use this term anarchitect and punk planner. Anarchitect's not a typo. I get questioned about it a lot. I'm not an architect because that is a licensed professional architects protect that title through legislation. But there's no licensing for anarchists. And my formal education, my degrees are both in architecture and planning. But my work and my research have been a resistance to, and they've been perceived as a resistance to those disciplines. And like many radicals, that was first a term that was applied to me and to my research, but one that I've really come to embrace and connect with, because I really oppose the archy. I oppose the structures and the rules of architecture. And I oppose the elitism and the arrogance of the profession and its gatekeeping of who gets to be an architect and who benefits from how they design and who they design for. And it makes me wonder a lot about why is it so hard to find spaces for this kind of divergent work and for different ideas and different practices. Why do I resist? But also, why do they resist? Why do the professions and the academic disciplines resist? Because they are the ones who resist. They resist change. They resist other voices and experiences. And they resist these other ways of thinking about cities and societies as more than just the objects that they get to plan and design, and more than just expressed through form and function. And for me, there were really two breaking points after I graduated from architecture. And while I was struggling to find a job, despite being the top graduating student in my class, I learned that while schools of architecture have been at least 50% female students since at least the 1990s, the profession was still only about 20% women. And my first and only real lead for a job was from a friend who let me know that his firm was hiring, and they were specifically looking to hire a female intern because they needed a woman to handle the clients. And this gendering of my potential as an architect kind of offended me at the time. But it also would lead me into this kind of path to the second breaking point. And I realized it wasn't just a question about where are the women in architecture. It was a question about where are the people in architecture. Why did we never talk about, why did we not think about, why did we not learn about people? And why were they only present kind of as these little scribbled figurines to give scale to our drawings and our designs? Where is society and culture and politics beyond architects thinking that they are producers of culture for the city? So clearly I was frustrated with this intense world of architecture, and I began to see its obsessive perfectionism with high design and how high design takes over every aspect of your world, and that you're trained to believe that if you're a good enough designer, you can design a solution to any problem. And it's such a deeply competitive world of expertise, and it individualizes our creativity. And this is part of what pushed me over into planning, thinking that planning might be kind of a more, have more of a social disposition. And the origins of planning kind of point to that. It comes out of reform movements to try to solve the ills of modern urban society that were resulting from industrialization. And this led to both kind of environmental reform movements and social reform movements. The environmental reformers were largely the architects and other professionals who believed that they could solve urban problems with better design, with better plans, and with standards that could bring beauty back and bring efficiency to the city. Social reform movements were dealing with the same problems of declining health and safety and the well-being of city dwellers, but they were really concerned with housing and labor rights and education and access to public services. You know, they were looking to bring the basics of care to the community. And these movements were largely led by women and by immigrants. And so there's a bit of a nature-nurture binary that starts to emerge from this, and it follows a gendered and a class division of labor. Planning professionalizes around the environmental reform movement, around land use and built form, and it professionalizes through public institutions and legislation. The social reformers, largely, they continue to rely on the unwaged labor of women and other minorities, and they start to operate and be pushed into and within the realm of the private domestic realm of home and community. So planning is definitely more public oriented than architecture, but it's still not people oriented, or not people oriented enough, in my opinion. Again, it's a profession that tries to imagine itself as an expert problem solver and as an objective decision maker that's responsible for built form in our environment and does so on behalf of the public. So now to kind of address what makes me, where I get the punk in Punk Planner. Because punk wasn't my teenage rebellion, I kind of came to it about the same time as this architecture rebellion. I came to punk through a bit of an unusual online dating story where I met a guy online and he was in a band, and he started taking me to shows and introducing me to his friends and to the scene. And we were kind of on and off for about 2 years. And when we finally broke up, I realized that I didn't find that relationship, but I had found a lifelong relationship with punk space and with punk community. And unlike architecture and kind of formal planning, creativity in this space wasn't a precious object that you labor over endlessly. It really values DIY, do-it-yourself ethics in punk music and zine culture, where it's about making a thing, and it's making it fast and sharing it with your community. And it can be dirty and messy and not fully thought through, and it's only half finished. And none of that really seems to matter. And it kind of makes it better that way. And for me, this was a space to see my world and myself differently, to respond to it differently, and to respond to it as part of community. Punk really was an escape for me into something completely different that I didn't really know I was looking for. It was a complete culture shock for me, but one thing in common is that architects and punks kind of always seem to wear black. So this brings us to our first pause for reflection. And I invite you for this one to either use the chat box or to reflect privately, or reflect with those in your home with you now, or with your cats or your plants. But I want to think about these divergent paths we end up on. And did it come from making a break from the norm or from the path you were on yourself? Or have you always been on a different path from the mainstream path? And when we think about this, that this is our journey, but it's not a journey we take alone or separated from space. So what are the places and who are the people that are on this journey with you? So I was thinking a lot about placemaking and community building and how they engage with formal plans, but also the role of activism and subversion. And I'm asking these questions about what's missing in traditional planning and mainstream urbanism. And my experience of coming into and participating in the punk scene seemed a way that I could contribute knowledge as part of my doctoral research, as part of knowledge that I had lived and that I had experienced. And so on top of kind of the more formal, traditional archival and theoretical research, my dissertation includes a lot of field work. And over 2 years, I attended about 115 different community participation events and 150 different punk shows, which covers 270 different bands, 67 different venues over 15 cities, but largely all of that was here in Ottawa, and a good chunk in Montreal as well. And as an observer participant, which is kind of the academic research term for this, I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I wasn't really taking notes. I wasn't conducting interviews with anyone, but I wanted to be able to speak from places, not just about them. And I wanted to learn with community and to contribute to that community through my own engagement. And something I didn't really think I was going to need to keep track of, but ended up being a good part, was how many punk bathrooms I ended up in. And punk toilets are pretty filthy spaces. It's always questionable when they've last been cleaned. There's usually one toilet that's backed up. There's a good chance that there is no toilet paper, no paper towels or soap. And I've become really good at squatting over the toilet and kind of under one arm, you make sure that your coat and your bag aren't going to touch the ground, and you have to have the other hand free to hold the door shut because the lock's been broken. And all of this, we don't really think about these things in toilets. We take a lot for granted. We don't normally think about the invisible labor that goes into cleaning all of our toilets all the time for us. And it becomes so perceivable when nobody's cleaning it. No one wants to clean a bathroom. And so why do we expect that someone's going to do it for us? Why do we expect that bar staff making minimum wage are going to do it? Why are there so many rules and such high expectations around toilets? And punk toilets, they break building codes, they break health codes, they break propriety codes and gender codes. More than once I've ended up in the wrong bathroom, either by accident or by necessity. And no one there seems to care, and I learned not to care. Before gender neutral standards were starting to be introduced into and really fought for in mainstream spaces, my punk experience had already really trained me to think of them as the bathrooms that are with or without a urinal. And punk toilets are these unlikely social spaces because it's one of the few spaces that's quiet enough to talk. It's one of the only spaces to overhear conversations, and it's the only space that's really bright enough for these nonverbal communications. The walls and the stalls get layered through all of these stickers and posters and graffiti, and there are sometimes these elaborate and wonderful and uplifting and supportive conversations through graffiti. And to start thinking about not just placemaking as what brings community together, but place marking, the marks we leave for each other, the way we communicate our presence to each other. So punk toilets are pretty clearly bad examples of material caretaking, but I'm arguing that they are places of social caregiving. While proper society gets repulsed by filth and dishevelment of chaotic spaces, maybe punk spaces point us to a different disgust for material culture and for privileging cleansed and orderly spaces and standardized spaces, and to reject society that cares more about space than it does about caring for people. And maybe we can refuse these standards of beauty and these standards for proper behavior, even if it means giving up having someone clean the toilet for us. Thank you all for the great, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, and I would go back and read them later, but I'm getting little glimpses of things. And so for the second one, we're going to move back into our breakout rooms for about 3 or 4 minutes, because I want to have a chance to have a conversation with people, and for you to have a chance to share some of your special spaces that are divergent from and unusual spaces that you have a love for and an appreciation for. And to think about the normal values of space that they kind of go against. Maybe they're ugly and dark and boring and old-fashioned, but they still bring something to you. They support divergent experiences of space. I want you to think about how you feel in these spaces. How does it change how you interact, and what memories does it bring up? So we're going to move into our breakout rooms for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and keep moving from there. And so, yeah, I clearly have this appreciation for unloved and but not lovable spaces, and that really starts to connect a lot of different research and some of my artistic practice and activism, and things that don't necessarily seem to be connected get connected through this. Back in 2014, I developed this walking tour about brutalist architecture in Ottawa, and it was triggered by the rejuvenation proposal for the National Arts Centre. And the proposal to abandon the main library branch and to start pursuing the construction of a new central library. And both of these are really great examples of brutalist architecture, but they were unrelentingly being represented as eyesores, as embarrassments to the national capital, and that this ugliness justifies rejuvenation projects and the pursuit of new landmark development. And on the one hand, my walk was trying to come to the defense of these buildings that I have such affection for. But on the other hand, and maybe more importantly, I was trying to highlight the irony that when these buildings were proposed in the 1960s, both of these buildings used very similar virtue claims about being great civic projects, that they would renew the city and that they would express the values of the nation through grand landmark architecture. And from 2011 to 2014, I was also part of a critical urban art collective called Impromptu Playground. And I think I saw Jeff's name pop up in the guest list here. Our installations were about bringing joy to ugly and mundane spaces, but also a critique about how we use public urban space and who gets to use it. This one is a project that I did with Musical Underground that was funded through an awesome Ottawa micro grant. And the idea was to create a pop-up performance space under the Queensway underpass, and to invite people passing by and ask if they play guitar and ask them to sing a song for us. And Impromptu Playground also made the first parklet in Ottawa as one of our first projects in 2011. We took over a parking spot in the Byward Market, we paid the meter, and then we kind of set up this little park. And this project is part of a broader movement that was growing around community urbanism, around tactical use and unsanctioned use of public space. And that was growing out of things like the Occupy movement, and was trying to connect to these longer histories of DIY and community-led placemaking. And in this kind of playful package was also a critique about the lack of green space, the prevalence of car culture, but was also more deep than that, was a critique about privatization of space and commodification of space, using the car as one symbol of this, but not necessarily the only target. It was kind of part of this empowering movement to try and reclaim control over space back to people and away from experts and away from governments and corporations. So really these projects were very successful. Projects like this were being shared locally. We were asked to bring the parklet on tour to a bunch of different neighborhood events. We got a lot of gigs for designing other tactical spaces in the city. And the city even consulted us when they were developing their own parklet pilot program. And projects like this were starting to go viral globally and really solidifying around tactical urbanism as a trend for cities to follow. But as the design concepts behind it were starting to spread, I became increasingly frustrated with how detached those were, kind of operating under tactical urbanism as a brand. It was really starting to be detached from the deeper social concepts and movements and critiques that we were raising and that started these movements. And capitalism, it just finds its way back in everywhere, right? It exploits both labor and it exploits space. And this is where I go from designing and advocating for urban joy to being an urbanist killjoy. Killjoy is a concept that I'm borrowing from the feminist Sarah Ahmed, and she argues that being labeled a killjoy is a way for mainstream to dismiss the complaints of those who complain about systemic injustices and inequities. And I have a lot of complaints about popular urbanism and where it's gone. Critical urbanism initially started and it continues in many practices as ways to reimagine space, but more importantly, to challenge the structures of the power and control of that space. And as a movement, it promised more action from the bottom up. And what's increasingly clear is that as it moved into mainstream urbanism, that has largely been taken over by middle up action, and that the benefits flow upwards and the costs get pushed downwards. And urbanist action happens at all these different levels in different communities, but there's clear patterns about the ones that cities are listening to, about whose projects move forward in cities and get funded by cities, and whose taste and lifestyle they appeal to and accommodate, and who profits from these. We need to think about whose livability is being improved through them, but also whose ability to live gets threatened and removed through these projects. So instead of transforming city planning, popular urbanism has given these new options for repeating the status quo, but in kind of this new trendy package, but it recreates a lot of the same biases and privileges and oppression that traditional planning does. Popular urbanism is especially appealing to progressive countries like Canada, right? Because Canada likes to hide our oppressive systems in this liberalism, in the appearance of diversity and inclusion and being forward-looking. Popular urbanism is just really good at woke washing space, and we see whose projects we like to model ourselves after, largely progressive European countries. We tend to continue to ignore good urbanism examples from the global south, and we appropriate urbanism from other communities and the projects that are rooted in non-white and non-settler communities. Woke washing, it's kind of like greenwashing. It's where you're kind of applying this concept of being woke and applying it to a space so that you read that space as woke. And please, we can chat more about that during the discussion if you want to bring it up again. I just saw that in the chat question. And so I've shared a lot of these killjoy hot takes on Twitter, and it's become a bit contentious and triggers a lot of mansplaining and some harsh pushback, including two subjects that, given the involvement I've had in Parking Day, I think most people kind of expect I'm going to back them up on. Cities for people, not cars, often passionately advocated for by cycling advocates. And I don't own a car, and I hope to continue to be able to choose a car-free life. I like bike lanes. I'm looking out at the O'Connor bike lane right now. I like riding my bike. I want to feel safe. I want to be better connected and to enjoy my ride. And I want to contribute to a healthier and a more sustainable city. But I'm also listening to Black folks and Black voices that say that the way cities are building cycling infrastructure does not make them feel safer using it, that it does not bring connectivity where they need it, that it is gentrifying their neighborhoods and damaging their ability to enjoy and stay in those neighborhoods. and that this displacement pushes them further away from public transit and away from cycling as an option, and that they are forced into these longer commutes and may have to work multiple jobs, and that gives them less time and access to leisure. So what I'm learning from this is not that shifting away from car dependency and adding more biking infrastructure is wrong, but if we're committed to doing this equitably and as anti-oppression, we need affordable housing, we need living wages, we need to fight for universal childcare and improved access to public services in all neighborhoods, and we need to defund the police and invest in services that are going to make the city safe for everyone. Cafes and parks and parking space patios. And we've seen a lot of this come up during COVID and COVID urbanism. I don't have a backyard or a balcony, and I like having access to public spaces where I can meet friends and I can enjoy the sun and some fresh air. I like being able to have a beer outside. And on a student budget, a $10 beer and $10 gourmet hot dogs is not within my budget very often. But when I lived in Montreal, I could do that by stopping in at a dépanneur, and I could buy a $2 beer and then go sit in the park. But in Ontario, to drink beer in public, it has to be served by a licensed establishment and within the licensed area. And while I know I can get away with drinking a beer in the park anyways, I hear the people who say that their public drinking is not tolerated in their neighborhood and not tolerated by police, and that their enjoyment and use of public space is not welcomed, that they feel unsafe and unwelcomed, and that they are seen as a threat to public safety. So Black folk and Indigenous people and people experiencing homelessness and mental health crises and drug addictions, they are over-policed and they're denied the same access to and enjoyment of public space. So what I'm learning is not that people don't want and don't deserve public space and spaces to gather together, but we need to commit to these being public spaces. We need them to be free and open to all sorts of public use and to provide equitable access and enjoyment for everyone. We need to deregulate and decriminalize the uses that discriminate against people. And we need to deprivatize and decommodify spaces that have been handed over from public space for private use and for private profit. And that's private car use, and that's private business use, and that is all the way up to challenging private property. So I'm happy to return to this slide during the conversation, but I really wanted to share kind of my process for working through these ideas. This summer, Jay Pitter, a Black urbanist and activist, she released a call to courage and an open letter for Canadian urbanists, and she offers 7 tangible steps for addressing anti-Black racism and urban inequity, including acknowledging that urban design is not neutral and that we need to reflect on our own implicit biases. And I take these steps to heart and how I approach this and this critique of mainstream urbanism, and that we need to think about whose livability gets improved. And you need to do that by speaking from I when you're projecting the value, right? I like bike lanes. I want to bike more. I want to feel connected. And we need to think about whose ability to live gets removed. And if that's not you, you need to listen to the people who are sharing their experience. So I'm happy to return to this, and I will share a link to Jay Pitter's call to action. And so I do get a lot of folks who are telling me, oh, so this is why we don't get to have nice things, or so if we can't fix all problems, then we should just do nothing. And planning and architecture and popular urbanism that don't challenge and privilege these systems of oppression within themselves first, we'll just go on making nice things for the most privileged and go on oppressing the most vulnerable and marginalized and those who diverge too far from the norm. So maybe we shouldn't get nice things, and maybe we should stop building until we start addressing these problems. And I really believe that for cities to be places where we can thrive, we need to be basing them on systems of care for each other, for non-human life and for the natural environment. We need to stop privileging development and land use and design as what dominates how we imagine cities and how we make cities. And this means we need to decenter the professions like architecture and planning. We need sociologists and geographers and healthcare professionals and scientists and artists and activists. And we need to deprofessionalize all of those professions and disciplines to take out the gatekeeping that prevents a diversity of representation, diversity of experience, and diversity of knowledge. We need empirical data and theory, but we also need these stories about lived experience, about memories, about spiritual and psychological meaning. So I do believe that it's possible to have nice things and to break systems of oppression, and that we can build cities together that are based in radical care and joy. And there are so many folks who are already doing this work and who have been arguing for this work for a long time. And we just need to listen better. And we need to let them guide us down these divergent paths away from mainstream cities that are built on oppression towards cities that are built with care. Thank you, everyone, so much for your time.
I have a question here from Nick. Do you want to share your experience and thought on what Ottawa should be with the people writing Ottawa's new official plan?
Yeah, and in case anyone doesn't know, the city has put out its draft official plan that's going to lead the next 25 years of development, and it's out right now for public feedback until March 12th, I think. And I think it does fall into the trap of these urbanism trends and these kind of keywords, and thinking that, oh, well, 15-minute cities, that's one of their big ones. That's good, right? Like that improves our lives. That's what people want. And it kind of falls into this trap of thinking about people of the city as this kind of holistic, oh, the public will want that. The public will like that. And not really interrogating what kind of impacts that might have on gentrification. Is that going to displace people? Is that going to take existing 15-minute neighborhoods and bring in new investment and bring in new residents? Not that that's bad, but when that shifts the economic division in the neighborhood, a lot of times that displaces people who've already benefited from, especially those with lower income and those in marginalized communities. So I think the city has a lot of work to do about equity and anti-oppression as it works through the new official plan.
Thanks, Sarah. We have a question from Tanya. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for that. I have a question. It's not fully formed. It's more just like a one-word question. Winter, and how do you make sense of Ottawa's official embrace of winter? Everybody's loving the SJAM trail so much, the canal, but I'm also thinking about how punk is sledding. Is it like how does that work in your theorizations? Thanks.
Yeah, so speaking from the I first, speaking from me, I hate the winter. I hate being outside in the winter. And I hate everyone telling me that if I just find a way to embrace winter, I will find joy in winter. No, I just hate it. I bear down and I get through it and hope for the summer on the other side. And that, but there is something to be said about the winter and the seasons kind of forcing us into different ways of thinking about space, different ways of engaging in space, and different ways of connecting with people in that space. So I think it's a great question, even though my point is going to be, no, boo winter.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Anya. That's a great question. Okay, let me quickly read here. A book recommendation. Oh, no, somebody's giving a book recommendation. But hey, Sarah, do you also have a book recommendation for folks that want to learn more about what you talked about today?
I do. I kind of expected that might come up.
Oh, and you've got one ready.
I've got one here. Black in Place. This one's a bit more on the academic side, but it's a great book by Brandy Thompson Summers about the spatial aesthetics of race and in a post-chocolate city. Great book. And then I'll also, this one, a lot of Ottawa folk have been involved in this one, Settler City Limits, about Indigenous resurgence and colonial violence in the urban prairie. And I'll share these to go out in the email afterwards.
You have a lot of questions, actually. So we're trying to do a fire line here. One from Jen Bernard. So Jen, I'll unmute you. If we can keep it quick, we can hopefully answer maybe one or two more.
So I would just love to hear your thoughts. I recently read an article about the stuff that's going on in Toronto with there's somebody that was building shelters for homelessness, and the city's taking legal action against them because of liability and all that stuff, but like that's like so like DIY to the core and to the heart. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on how to navigate that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And that really does go to a lot of what I was speaking to, right? Of this professionalization of who gets to be an architect, who gets to do it. And then that gets protected behind these kind of, oh, it's for city, it's for public safety. And we need to accredit people to know that they're able to do it. But we also need people to just take care of each other. And these kind of mutual aid movements that are like, you know, the city's not taking care of us, the professions aren't taking care of us, but we know how to take care of our community, and we can go out and do it with them. I'm all for that.
Is there any way to try to like navigate? Because there was a similar thing in my hometown. Like a guy built a ramp, and they're like, "Yo, that's not safe," and they tore it down. They spent $50,000 to build this new ramp. And like, is there a way to like navigate with the city to try to compromise with them to get those DIY projects to happen without having to spend crazy budgets?
You know, the sad thing that I've seen is that as it gets negotiated through the city, it gets watered down and it gets pushed back up towards the middle. And so it really is hard to work with the city in the short term. I think a lot of this is going to move forward. And I hope that these actions come together in bigger movements that are putting a lot of pressure on the city. But so far, I haven't seen much examples of it being successful in the short term. And it really does take the nimbleness of activists to do the work that the city won't do.
Okay, another question, Cammie's question. How do you feel the pandemic will affect the future design of cities? That's a great one.
This is one that I've tried to avoid answering, and I try to not read the people who think they know what this means. It's so hard in this space, and the people who are out there just taking care of each other, I don't think that they have the time to think about what this is going to mean. And I want to hear from them before we start projecting, you know, these grand designs and these grand new utopias that are going to come out of the pandemic. I think right now is the time for action and the time for care. And we'll see where, once we get a chance to breathe, what ideas we can come up with together.
That's one. Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful answer. I like not operating in assumptions necessarily, you know, especially not talking to the people it's impacting. Scott, I'd love to unmute you. I see you have your hand raised.
Hey all, hey Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing. My question is that I know you're located in Montreal or for your studies, and I'm thinking of organizations like Entremise and La Pépinière who do kind of temporary and transitory use of spaces, but I feel that in order for it to be well accepted, it needs to still fit certain guidelines aesthetically and things like that. But do you think that it's a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I will let that is kind of the question of my dissertation, and I don't have an answer for you yet. You know, what is this kind of this middle action, and what does that, how do we create more good for more people? But how do we make sure that isn't putting more hurt and more harm down the line, and that it really is a just redistribution and a just kind of consciousness raising for more people. So I think around the consciousness raising, it's been a really important part. I still don't see the structural impacts yet, but we're working on it.